Joining us in today's episode from Canada is award-winning freelance journalist Jessica Scott-Reid. Jessica is known for her comprehensive coverage of animal rights stories in the media, be it animal agriculture, plant-based athletes, society's language when writing or speaking about animals, regulations that can hinder activists' ability to document the horrors of animal exploitation. You know, the list goes on. In fact, not only has her work been featured in leading vegan media outlets like Sentient Media and Planet Friendly News, but Jessica is also determined to expand her audience and reach more people. She continues to accomplish this with her published work in the Toronto Star, Vox, CBC News, and many, many more. In this chat, Jessica shares her experiences becoming a passionate animal rights activist, tapping into her knack for writing as her form of activism, her challenges publishing animal rights content in the mainstream, and insights on how we could overcome these hurdles, and so much more. Jessica reminds us that activism does not have to look one certain way, and that our lives offer multiple opportunities to be active for the animals, be it by writing letters to the editor and opinion pieces in your local papers, sharing them with your pre-vegan friends and family, or even for those who have children, advocating for field trips to sanctuaries instead of petting zoos. As activists, we should not underestimate the impact that these simple acts can have in our communities. So without any further delay, I am very excited to bring you the lively Jessica Scott-Reid. Welcome to the Animal Liberation Hour, Jessica. I'm so happy you were able to join us today.
Yes, thank you so much for thinking of me and having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'd cross paths occasionally on some Clubhouse chat rooms, and I'd actually heard you on multiple podcasts before that as well. So when I first saw you in a Clubhouse room, and I think we were both on stage, I was like, "Oh my God, that's her!" I've read her articles and everything, and so it was really cool. Then to develop that relationship and connection, and then learn a lot about the work that you do. And you've been such an invaluable resource to
thank you.
Just not just the animal rights community, but getting the word out to the quote unquote mainstream and the general public. So I'm really excited to talk to you about your story and your journey and your plans for the future.
Oh, good. Let's dive right in.
Let's go for it. And of course, one of the things that we really value here at Animal Activism Mentorship is finding similarities in one another's stories and connections. So, folks in the movement have something really deep and meaningful within the animal rights community. So with that, what was your journey connecting with animal rights? I know I'm pretty familiar with this story, but I think it's so amazing. It's just so relatable. So I'm excited to share this with everyone.
Yeah, admittedly, I've done quite a few podcasts. I've told this story, but every time I tell it, it's always in a bit of a different context with a bit of a different audience. And so it often takes a little bit of a different path. In this context, the idea of, telling a story, a version that, most people will connect to, I think the most important part of it is that, I wasn't born vegan, like so many of us weren't, but I was born an animal lover. And I think throughout my childhood and growing up, I always cared about animals and I cared about the planet. I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s. So that's when the whole Kids for Saving Earth movement began. And Free Willy was an issue. So I remember standing out in front of my house, holding a sign saying Free Willy to whoever was driving past. And so that,
outside your house, not even like
honestly, I
not
think
a
I was
marina
like,
park or anything.
no, just on my front lawn. I was
I
probably
love that.
7 or 8 years old.
I love
So
that.
it started early. But
Mhm.
to make the connection with the food that we ate took a long time, because so many of us as kids aren't taught what we're eating. We don't really realize that we're eating our friends. And so later on in life, in my early 20s, I became a vegetarian after first seeing a PETA video about dog meat, the most horrific thing I'd ever seen in my life. And then later on in life, as I started writing about food and culture when I was living overseas, writing a little bit more about ethical eating, and even wrote about things like humane slaughter and ethical meat and organic farming. Really trying to find a way to all make it make sense, and I never could. So through my journey of writing about animal welfare and food systems, I too became a vegan. It really went alongside having my daughter Clover. She's almost 6 years old now. As soon as I had to feed her food, like solid food, like put food in front of her, I couldn't put animal products in front of her. And so that started my journey, and really my writing just coincided with it. And as soon as I really took the vegan perspective into my writing, it took off, and here I am 6 years later.
So so your interest and passion for writing was not necessarily connected to animal rights in the beginning. It's like, oh, I want to pursue a career in writing. And then as you were on your own journey on, I guess, easing some sense of dissonance that you felt at some level.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Like I was writing about food and culture because I was living overseas at the time in Europe, and I was living in Switzerland to begin with, where the Eat Local movement was a big deal, and the idea of eating cheese from a cow that you could see in the pasture outside your house really fascinated me. That felt good and nice. And so when I was writing about food and culture and these different ethical food movements, it really came together that what I was writing was bullshit. I had to figure out how to make it feel right for me. And becoming vegan and writing about veganism was how that happened.
Yeah, and if I recall, you even you went to the extent of actually researching the farms and like going out and scouting the farms to make sure that you were getting the quote unquote humane, free range, throw whatever token label you want.
Yeah, because after I was vegetarian for a while, I started, thinking I was doing this ethical meat thing. And I went to such extreme lengths to try and find these happy meat products, driving super far out to farms, going to sanctuaries that still sold eggs, hiking in mountains to go get cheese direct from the farmer.
Wow.
Such hard work. It felt wholesome at the time, but it also felt completely unsustainable. Something I really couldn't promote for everyone to do. And so how could this make sense? And it just didn't. And it all went alongside my own education. I got a BA in communications, and then when I was living overseas, I did a master's degree in cultural studies and started blogging about my life overseas, and that's how this all progressed.
Wow. And if I may ask a question related to that process of, searching for these labeled animal products, do you think that, because I'm thinking of it in two ways. One is you really, really cared about the well-being of the animals. And two, you really did not want to let go of certain animal products. So you wanted to do it the best way possible. And I'm not saying it has to be one or the other. It could be a mix of both. But kind of from where you are right now and thinking back, do you think you might have some hindsight as to what that could have been?
You know what? It was a pivotal moment for me. I remember right before I had to start feeding my daughter food and really made this decision. I was speaking with Anna Pippis. You might know her more as Easy Animal Free on Instagram. She's the cookbook author. At the time, she was a lawyer with Animal Justice here in Canada. And she said something so profound to me. She gets the medal for veganizing me ultimately.
Wow.
And it was so simple. And it was, we don't have to eat this.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I had ever heard that before. Like, I had already been against circuses and against zoos and against fur and against leather and against every other aspect of animal harm and exploitation that there was, except for eating them.
Yeah.
And it was because I thought eating them was the only one that made sense, that was necessary. The only one that we couldn't do without. The rest we could avoid, but this one we couldn't avoid. And she said, oh no, you can, it's fine. And I was like, oh, what? And then she sent me, the information from the, the Academy of Dietetics, that says that it's, perfectly fine for people of all ages to eat a well-planned vegan diet. And it blew my mind.
I think that's a very valid trajectory and perspective of sometimes that external assurance is very powerful. So I appreciate that story. And as you pivoted into writing more about animal rights, what kind of challenges did you face along the way? Because if I understand correctly, you're in the freelancing space as opposed to being 100% affiliating with any one particular media company. So this could be a two-part question as to one, why you chose to freelance over, being with one company full-time, and the challenges that you face in different outlets when it comes to covering issues related to animal rights.
Well, I think both those questions go hand in hand, because it wasn't that I chose to be freelance. It's that it was and still kind of remains to be the only option. If somebody wanted to give me a full-time, animal rights, climate change, food systems column in a newspaper, sign me up. But it doesn't exist yet.
If someone is listening,
yes,
anyone in the New York Times, Washington Post,
right?
Please. Nudge, nudge.
Seriously, but yeah, so that's the thing. I freelance because it's the only option for me right now. But also it allows me to work with a much broader audience. There are some really great animal advocacy publications, Sentient Media, which I also contribute to, Planet Friendly News, which I also contribute to. But if I were to only write for them exclusively, I'd really miss out on these mainstream audiences. But once I, at the beginning, decided that I wanted to write about, animals and plant-based foods and things like this full time, the biggest challenge was getting anybody to listen. Thankfully, around 6 or so years ago when I started, this was kind of a start to this being an issue that the editors and audiences cared about. So I really had to kind of push and pester to get these stories in, and I got rejected a lot. And I honestly thought the bubble would pop eventually. Things picked up quite quickly. A lot more things were coming to light. More celebrities were going vegan. A lot more issues where climate change was becoming a bigger issue. But I eventually thought it was just going to stop being popular. But now we've seen this is here to stay. Climate change, unfortunately, will always be pushing these stories to the forefront of mainstream media. And if we can get the voice of animals within that storyline, I will always try and do that, because it's a big part of it. It's less challenging now. I don't get rejected nearly as much as I used to, which is great.
Yeah.
But the challenge still remains being a voice for animals in the media, but doing so in a way that mainstream audiences will still see you as clever and not crazy. That's always my motto: clever, not crazy. And having to find that line within each publication is important.
So you feel like, depending on the media outlet, do you find that you are adjusting your tone of writing accordingly? So
yeah, always, constantly. Every publication is different. I know which boundaries I can push in which publications. I know which one requires a certain use of language to describe the things that I often talk about. Yeah. But ultimately, like I always tell people who I help teach write op-eds and letters to the editor, when we're writing about animal rights issues in particular, we don't have to be exaggerated. I don't have to be the over-the-top crazy vegan in these publications, because the truth is as bad as it needs to be.
Yeah.
Let the facts speak for themselves. And it's already stuff that people don't really know. And that's what we're here to do, is show people what just exists. We don't have to be over the top. They just don't know that piglet thumping is a thing. Just tell them that, and do it as professionally as you can, so that credibility stays with you, and the facts become the story instead of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and this is a conversation that is pretty prominent within the animal rights spaces. How can we effectively get the message out without just by default being disregarded as crazy animal rights people, or just people presenting biased facts? That's something that I think about a lot too, because first off, it's not common that we see animal rights related content in the mainstream. Where we do see it is within the animal rights space. And presenting that to the public is like, oh, you're only presenting animal rights media, so it's biased. And it's like, you can't have it both ways, you know? It's either, it's hard to prove objectivity when the only people willing to provide the platform are usually exclusively animal rights media, like, and very important platforms like Sentient Media and all these Veg News and all these platforms that are, you know, catering to different audiences. Some have a more, you know, fun new product celebrity angle, and some are gonna have a more hardcore activism and climate change and have these difficult conversations. So I think it is a tricky space because how we've come to rely on certain aspects of media, be it social media, be it cable television. Like, it's, I don't know, as I think about it, it's just making me really anxious.
It's okay. Know that every bit plays its part. And, you know, I will do what I can in the mainstream media to expose audiences to things that most of us in this community already know about, and that we should continue talking about, and more in-depth and further broader conversations within our advocacy publications, Sentient, Veg News, etc. But then we can take, you know, the basics. And I think that's very important in the animal rights world, is that when we're disseminating information about things that we claim to know, make sure you know, you know, like, make sure you check your facts. Don't just, you'll go off one source. Don't just get your information from a social media post or from another activist. Always cross-reference, always double check, because credibility is everything. And like I said, the facts are there. Just make sure you get them straight. They're bad enough as it is.
100%. Yeah, I think that's, as unfortunate as it is to say, it's also, it works in our favor that we don't need to over embellish the horrors of animal abuse, because just a very objective description in of itself is very alarming. Yeah. So from your experience, do you think there are certain strategies that we as the animal rights community and writers who are passionate about writing and about presenting this information can take when pitching their pieces to the conventional media outlets there are? Because one of the things that former guest on our podcast and incredible activist Jane Velez Mitchell said was, one of the issues within the mainstream media is the role that the advertisers play. And a lot of these advertisers they have interests in different animal exploitative industries. So when it comes to finding a space to present these issues, it becomes a conflict of interest there. So just keeping that in mind, do you think there is something that aspiring writers can do differently? And from your experience, do you feel like there's some wisdom you can offer?
That's a hard one to avoid. I know there's definitely been certain publications that I've tried to write for regarding farmed animals specifically, where I never was able to, because they had, like you said, conflict of interest, investment, usually in the meat lobby. Like, for example, my hometown news broadcast is sponsored by the pork council, the local pork council. So, you know, when we were talking about ag gag laws in our province, they didn't want to talk about it. And so I think you just have to cut those losses, because there's not much you can do about that, but there will always be more. You know, there's never just one outlet in one area. So my recommendation to, you know, advocates that want to write, Start local. That's a grassroots effort when you're working with your local media. Everything has to be timely. It has to be, there has to be a news hook. So you can't just, suddenly think like, well, I want to talk about, why it's wrong to keep, orcas captive or something. There has to be a news hook, something tied to something that's happening, a study that's come out, a law that's going to pass, something horrific that's happened. And once it does, jump in there. Start with letters to the editor. That's my advice. Start with letters to the editor, honing your voice, becoming succinct and able to put your thoughts into, not too many words, because that's often an issue with new writers is writing too much. And once you get a few of those published, then start, towards an op-ed, which is in the opinion section. And op-ed editors are always looking for new voices. So just keep that in mind. There's no reason why you can't be there. As an advocate, as a local person within your community, if you have something, a story to tell, an opinion to make, a thesis to make that only you can make, that's what they want. So be a voice for animals in the media, present yourself as a local and as an animal advocate, and that this is your well thought out thesis. And there's no reason why an editor shouldn't be interested in who you are and what you have to say.
Yeah, that is very, very, that was very, very valuable advice. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because I think when we think of mainstream, the first thing that comes to mind is, how do I get on CNN? How can I write for the New York Times? And it's starting local, like you said, mobilizing grassroots, local communities. There is a lot of power in that. And, we also really celebrate when we have people who are vegans, pro-animal rights in the mainstream, like, there's Ezra Klein. And then, there are these people who have somehow miraculously, and of course, owing to their wonderful merit, made it in these spaces and it's great that they are there, but it would be, and I'm sure, and I would imagine that they also do struggle with being able to be 100% authentic in presenting these issues where they are. But at the same time, it is a huge win knowing that folks like that, influential people in media, are there. But yeah, I just wish that was kind of the norm, as opposed to having to celebrate that on occasion, that, oh my gosh, Ezra Klein is there.
I mean, I'm hoping that it's just because it's still somewhat new, right? Like having the vegan idea, the vegan philosophy in any sort of broad publication is still sort of new. So we're still celebrating when it happens. It would be great when it becomes the norm. I mean, like today I just published a piece for Sentient Media about the misrepresentation of animals in the media, and how often, publications are still regarding animals as it. So we're still dealing with these very archaic ideas, right down to the use of language. So we have made successes in a lot of ways, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I love the idea of grassroots activists and advocates taking to their local papers or their local reporters and telling them what they need to hear about animals constantly, making sure that the animal voice becomes part of the way that we tell these stories about, animal farming and food production. Be what the animals need in the media, right? Carve out that space for them that for so long they haven't had. And it should be done at a grassroots level. I still write for my local paper all the time. So I might write for national papers or Vox.com or whatever, but I still write for my national paper or my local paper all the time.
Yeah, I love that. And what inspired you to pursue writing as your form of activism, or what inspired you to use your passion and use that for activism? Because there's one thing of making that connection and being like, oh my God, I don't want to participate and contribute to that, so therefore I'm just going to make my own personal changes and live my life, versus you decided to turn that into actionable change and using your skills and your talents for this cause. So do you feel like that was because of the content you were already covering, or did you feel called to activism through was there some spark that said, I want to be active for the animals, but I think writing is my way to do it?
I don't think there was an actual moment. I think it sort of evolved together. I mean, I wanted to write about animals and food because those are two of my favorite things. So it started with just a passion and an interest. And I remember saying it out loud, like, oh, all I want to write about is animals and food. And I was like, well, can I just do that? Can I just make that happen? I thought it sounded crazy, but then I did. The reason for it now, in full honesty, it's desperation. People ask me so often, how can you deal with seeing such horrible things, learning about such horrible things, and talk about such horrible things on such a regular basis? And I said, the only reason it works is because then I get to do something about it. If I didn't get to then go and write about it and do something that felt productive and helpful, I would probably have lost my mind a long time ago. But because I have the privilege and the honor and the responsibility to go forward and tell the world about this horrible thing that I've just learned, that allows me to kind of feel like I'm taking it a bit off my back. I don't know how activists, grassroots activists who, are just doing street activism all the time, and that's such a hard thing to do, and it can feel so futile. I've done some of it. Can continue on. I'm so grateful for them, and feel like I wish I could learn how to have more strength like they do, because I get to just, every day write out my feelings and then get paid for it.
Yeah. And I think, you bring up a very valuable point there, in that I don't think it's necessary that every activist has to do that one form of street activism, because there are so many other avenues that are going to get across to other people. Like maybe someone just who isn't living in a place where people are outside a fur store protesting, they're probably going to read a piece in their local paper about it, and that's going to perhaps spark change for them. So I think there is a lot of value in presenting different forms of activism and showing that there are very valid ways to create the change for the animals, and the only way to do it is not by having a megaphone, or is not by going to a vigil. If that doesn't fuel you, if that doesn't feel like a sustainable form of activism for you, that's okay.
Yes, this is something we've learned a lot about. I don't know if you've heard of the Animal Justice Academy.
Yes.
It's run through Animal Justice here in Canada, and that's a big thing that we've talked about in a lot of the workshops, is how to be an activist where you're at. Like you said, not everybody can, hold a megaphone or stand outside a fur store. It might not even be accessible for a lot of people, right? That might not even be an option in your community. Mm-hmm. So we've talked a lot about how to be an activist in the different forms of life that you were already, participating in, how to be an activist at your work, how to, get change at your office, how to write a letter to the editor as a form of your, weekend activism, and to meet people where they are. Mm-hmm. To find inroads, to have these conversations, activism at the dinner table with your family, right? So there's a lot of different ways of being an activist. And I love to encourage advocates who have a voice to write those letters to the editor, because that's a way that I know can be very fulfilling and easy to do. Everybody can write a letter to the editor.
Yeah, definitely. All you need is a computer and access to a local news outlet, and just write a response. And
I often tell people, that little rant that you put on Facebook underneath your local news story about a horrific barn fire, where they talk about, the poor farmers who lost all their money, instead of talking about the animals, and then you go on a little rant. Take that little rant off Facebook and instead put it in an email and send it to the editor.
Yeah, hey, exactly. Love that. That is very valuable advice for sure. And just based off of your experience writing for both exclusively vegan media and the mainstream, hopefully they just intermingle and there's no segregation between the two. But up until now, what have you liked, and where do you think, I think we both know where the quote unquote mainstream can improve, but and outside of the benefits of a wider audience, what other advantages does that have for you as a writer? And likewise for the vegan media outlets, where do you think we can improve on that front?
I think writing for mainstream media, what has been very helpful for me is to always keep myself in check, to know that, to imagine that every time I'm writing something, I'm writing it directly to a farmer, I'm writing it directly to a meat lobbyist, and knowing that I'm going to probably hear from them after I do. So it makes me very sure of what I'm saying. It makes me anticipate the arguments that will come against what I'm saying before I'm saying them, so that my facts are straight, my perspective is clear, and knowing that this is going to ruffle feathers, which is the point, but also being prepared for it. So as a novice writer, I probably took liberties that I would never take now, because now I know that they're going to come for me on Twitter and I better be prepared. So now I really keep my stuff straight. On the other hand, writing for purely vegan publications, the best part about that has been how liberal it is, and how I can push those boundaries, and I can make those statements or evolve my own philosophical thinking about things beyond what I could possibly do in mainstream media. And that helps my general perspective to be able to write for both.
Yeah, and I think it's also nice to know that you can just write without having to sugarcoat things when you're writing for vegan media. And also, there, as much as, we talk about not preaching to the choir, I think there is some benefits to it, in that not everybody in our quote unquote choir is necessarily active for the animals. It's sometimes we take in this information and we're just being reassured that we're making good choices. But sometimes the more people see these pieces, it could spark that willingness to actually do something about it and explore ways to do something about it.
Yes, and there's new people reading it every day, don't forget too, right? Like our choir grows every day. So also knowing that you might be, I might be writing about why dairy is cruel for the 10th time ever. But this article that's going to come out tomorrow might be the first time that somebody is going to see it. Even if it is for a vegan publication, it might be a new somebody who's contemplating being vegan, or a new animal lover, or somebody who joined a circus protest and is going a little deeper, and they might be seeing that article for the first time and had no idea about what makes dairy cruel. So I know that there are people having this change of thought every single day, and I want to be there for them too. It might be old news to us, but there's still a lot of people learning.
So you mentioned the animal justice in Canada. So I'm curious as to where that interest came from, and if you can tell us what animal justice does, and the legal work that you do, just to fill our listeners in case they're not familiar.
So Animal Justice is an animal rights law firm based here in Canada. They have an Animal Justice Academy, which brings together thousands of different activists, advocates, and animal lovers from all over the world to learn different ways of being an activist. It's been very popular, but Animal Justice itself, they represent animals in Canada. So currently, right now, I'm working with them on a lawsuit against the Ontario government, one of the provinces here in Canada that's enacted egg gag legislation. And I, as a journalist, as well as another activist in Toronto and Animal Justice, are suing the Ontario government that this violates our charter right of freedom, and especially my freedom of the press. And in evidence, we have a lot of the articles that I've written, at least like a dozen, I think, that I've written that essentially could not have been written without the help of whistleblowers, undercover investigators, and activists who have been able to provide evidence and footage and insights from on farms and outside trucks. So that's just one of the things that Animal Justice does. We also hosted a podcast together for a while called Paw and Order. Sadly, it's no longer, but it still exists. It's still there, talking about all the issues pertaining to animals in the media and in law in Canada and all over the world. So it's there as a good archived resource too. So Camille Labchuk is the executive director. She was my co-host. She's my friend and my go-to source for all Canadian animal legal issues. She's brilliant.
Yeah, I've seen Camille on a few documentaries as well, and I've listened to a few episodes of Paw in Order, and they're really interesting. And I'm not very familiar with Canadian legal issues, but just an overarching idea of how ag-gag laws work, and like some of the marine land?
Yeah, marine land. Boo,
Yeah.
marine land.
Yeah, so some of the issues related to it was really interesting to hear different countries' legal occurrences, of what's happening for the animals. And so as far as representation for the animals go, does animal justice do they have certain species of animals who they represent, or is it no questions asked?
They represent.
No questions asked. Yeah, no questions asked. They also do some help, some work in the plant-based food sector too. But if there's an animal in need of legal representation, they are the ones that you call. If there needs to be some investigation into horrific deaths in the animal, agriculture industry, they're the ones who are going to look into it. We work a lot hand in hand, but they are my ultimate resource. That's who I go to first and foremost for anything here in this country.
Cool. That's really great that there are such resources, and more are hopefully popping up across the globe to provide activists and journalists and just everybody these resources. They are very important. And kind of owing to both your experiences as a writer and someone who's interested in the law, and you're learning about the law and gaining expertise in that front as well, do you find a difference in the reception to different animal rights related issues? Like, for example, animals used as part of the food supply chain or in the fashion industry or for experimentation. Do you think one is an easier way in versus another? This is again based off of your experience.
For sure, like both in media, in culture more broadly, and in the legal system, we see, of course, that companion animals are a completely different thing. They are afforded so many more. I mean, obviously, it's not perfect, and there's a lot of work to do there too. But things we always say, things that you could do to a pig, you'd be thrown in jail for, at least fined. If you did it to a dog, you'd be chastised by your community. You'd be thought of as a horrific human being. But if you do it to a pig, it's just standard practice. So that's definitely something I run into a lot. I know I can say and do a lot more when it comes to suffering of companion animals, exploitation of companion animals, than I can farmed animals. And then things like captive whales and dolphins, animals involved in animal testing, and even horses. They're all kind of in this middle ground. Horses in particular are an interesting one because they really sort of bridge the animal agriculture world and the companion animal world, and bring in a lot of different types of people.
And
a lot of different varying
world.
Ideas. That too, yes, and horse racing and things like that. So there's definitely different degrees to what you can say about animals in mainstream media and in culture in general, depending on the species. It's for sure a thing.
Yeah, that's times like this. I'm like, it sounds so daunting, but then at the same time, when you understand that as we elevate the status of animals, it's kind of like the dominoes are going to fall, like the oppressive systems. One falls, everything falls, because those systems of oppression are connected.
And I think you got to use what you can, right? Like we often talk at Sentient Media as well, the value of, even though they want to focus so much on animal agriculture, there's value in telling the stories of these other animals in different exploitative systems and institutions. Not only because they deserve to be talked about, but also because it brings in more people. It brings in other people. There's a lot of non-vegans who care about animal testing. Cruelty-free beauty and cleaning products are huge now, and it's not vegans that are the only ones buying them, right? So being able to talk about companion animals, horses, captive animals, zoo animals, circus animals, it gets people to start thinking about all animals differently.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. So throughout your journey and up until where you are now, I'd imagine that there have been people along your way who have inspired you, mentored you, and maybe continue to do so. So would you mind sharing a few of them for with our community?
Camille Labchuk, like we've already mentioned, is my first and foremost. She continues to be my mentor. She's my sounding board. She's the one that always has the answer when I don't. And she offers the perspective, this unapologetic, but still very clever perspective on all things to do with animals. Whenever I'm unsure, can I say this? She says, yes, you can. And once she says, yes, you can, I feel 100% confident saying it. So she's my ultimate for sure.
Oh, I love that. And I'm sure she is going to really appreciate hearing that too. And you both do have
she knows.
I'm sure. I know. It's like, well, you have, just from listening to both of you on the podcast, the rapport is so evident. So I just love that mutual friendship term. That's also a mentorship. It's a wonderful thing to have in our community of animal
We
rights
need it.
activists.
We need it.
Yes. Speaking of things we need is mental health and self-care. So what are your tips and tricks to keep yourself sane?
Oh gosh. Thankfully, like I said, the fact that I get to write out my feelings as my job is really part of my self-care. So it's a double-edged sword. It's hard work. It's often about horrible things, but because I get to express, it helps. So find what helps you express. Because expressing, think about the root of the word express. It's letting out, right? We must let out. But also spending time in nature with my dogs, with my daughter, in my garden, in my backyard, and going hiking. That is my mental health wellness to the max. When I feel like I can't pull myself out of some of these dark holes, I take my dogs, my daughter, and go for a good hike in nature, and boom, in an hour, suddenly the world looks different. That's my go-to.
Wow, that is magic. I love that. And how about your daughter? Do you find it challenging to discuss these issues, or do you feel that it's your responsibility to provide that transparency that many of us didn't receive as kids growing up?
Absolutely. Yeah. It feels like an obligation. And not only that, she's only 5 and she is already like a wild little activist. So it is not hard to talk with these things, of course, age appropriately with her, because she's interested. And, like she'll see a commercial on TV for like egg farmers of Canada, and she'll yell at the TV, leave the chickens alone.
Oh, yeah.
It's
We
so
love
cute.
those. We love young activists who are unapologetic about
She
their
is unapologetic. And I think that inspires and motivates me, because her way of thinking is so pure and so right and so unmessed with, like to her it's just logical.
Unadulterated.
Yes, unadulterated.
Adults.
Unadulterated.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He says it and sees it so clearly, which makes me realize it's like everything she says, it's like, oh duh, right?
Yeah.
And so it helps me in that way. And so I don't find it difficult at all. Navigating so far, having a vegan child in a very non-vegan world, hasn't been as hard as I expected. Like in a couple weeks, her class is going to visit a farm, like a petting farm, where they're gonna like shear sheep and milk a goat and hold baby chicks. And she's just not going. And I took the opportunity to write the school and in an email very politely, and just said, our family doesn't support these types of activities, and so Clover will be spending the day with me at an animal sanctuary instead. Here's an article I wrote about what makes petting farms not so great, and here's an article I wrote about an animal sanctuary 20 minutes away that you might consider for future field trips instead. Boom. Such a simple thing to do. That's activism. That's something that a parent could do.
So powerful. Yes. So I have no children, human children of my own. I also don't consider my companion animal my child. But that being said, I'm sure that there are people out there who might be there. Like we have activists who are just pros raising badass vegan activist kids, but there might be some new people who are figuring out how to navigate that space and learning about these forms of oppression and worried about their kids fitting in. So this is so helpful for those who might be feeling like, oh, I don't want to support this, but I don't want to make my kid feel left out. But
it's, again, that idea of being clever, not crazy. It still applies, right? And I think if your kid, like Clover's on board, she gets a day off school and gets to go to an animal sanctuary.
She still gets to hang out with animals, but
and her teacher's supportive, and her teacher's saying, like, Clover gets to come back the next day and explain to the class what an animal sanctuary is, and Clover's very excited to do that. So she's going to have a moment of activism too. And I know that the school is interested in this sanctuary and is looking into it for next year. So if there's any parents out there that need more, direction on these things of how to approach it, diplomatically, so that you're not the weirdo. I have a lot of articles on vegan parenting that could be helpful. Or I know articles on petting farms that you could just send an email.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. How not to be a weirdo as a vegan 101. It should have been
I'm still working on it.
I know. It's like, I think the fact that we are vegans and very loud and proud about it just qualifies as weird by default.
You know what? There is room for weird.
Yes.
There's just sometimes in places where it works against us. And I think being selective about where we let the weird out is important.
Absolutely. Love it. So how can our listeners follow you, Jessica? Any, anything that we can do to support your work outside of trying to find you a permanent spot in a mainstream outlet?
Follow me and read my work and share my work. I hope it resonates with you if you're an animal lover and animal activist. I'm hoping that it will. Most of my work is shared on Twitter at Jess L. Reid, R-E-I-D. And then also my Instagram is a little bit more of my personal side. I share a lot of my plant-based cooking, again, my vegan parenting, and also my work. So if that resonates more with you, you can find me on Instagram at JessLSR.
Beautiful. And lastly, I like to personally end with this one question. Jessica, what does your idea of a just, equitable, kind, vegan world look like to you?
My motto always is, those who can be vegan should, and most of us can. So I'm less of someone who advocates for a vegan world, but I do advocate for all of those of us who are privileged enough to be able to walk to the grocery store and buy a can of beans instead of a piece of a dead animal is what we should be doing. And I think it really is as simple as that. Yeah.
And before we know it, that will be the norm. And we'll reach a point where future generations are going to be appalled by the fact that people ate parts of dead animals.
100%.
Yeah. Thank you again so much, Jessica. Your insights have been so incredible, and I'm just so thankful for the work that you do, and I'm excited to see your future work. Your writing is phenomenal, very engaging, and I also just enjoy hearing you speak about all of your stories and ventures. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for all the work that you do too. We are in this together. So thank you for your inspiration as well, and for thanking me for this great podcast.
Yeah, our pleasure. Talk soon.
Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed this chat with Jessica as much as I did. As always, you can find the links to Jessica's social media handles and some samples of her published work in the show notes. For our legal enthusiasts and creative activist listeners, be sure to check out the Animal Justice Academy for a plethora of their savvy resources and enlightening discussions centered on educating, empowering, and uplifting the activist community. Again, there is no standalone way to achieve animal liberation. And if writing is your passion, I'm optimistic that Jessica's insights will inspire your own creativity in utilizing your talents to further progress the animal rights movement. Before we sign off, please take a quick minute to rate and review the podcast. It helps others find it more easily, and the more people who find it, the more they can be inspired by the guests we interview and turn that into actionable change for the animals. Plus, if you have any guest suggestions for whom you'd like to see featured on our podcast, feel free to reach out to us on social media. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to check out our website, animalactivismmentorship.com, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship, where you can keep up with the podcast as well as all things AAM. Accessibility to our content without any hindrance is key to our work here at AAM. That's why it's important to us that we offer our resources for free. So if you like what we do at the Animal Liberation Hour and at AAM, and would like to support us, of course, given that you have the financial ability to do so, please feel free to contribute to our Patreon. It helps keep us going. AAM is proud and honored to be fueled by Farm Animal Rights Movement. One more reminder that you can sign up for a free mentor to help you with your activism at animalactivismmentorship.com. So if you are still waiting for that sign that you should be an activist for the animals, this is it. Now remember that it will take all of us to achieve animal liberation. And as my good friend and co-host Trey says, it is not a sprint, it is a marathon. So we've got to stay focused, stay positive, take care of ourselves, and be the change of compassion that we envision for this world. Until next time.